Today on the Dig In podcast, I'm joined by a woman who has done something no one in history has ever done. She's Jewish, she belongs to an Orthodox synagogue, she does not believe Jesus is the Messiah, and yet she became the first Jewish person to ever teach the New Testament at the Vatican's Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome. Her name? Dr. Amy Jill Levine. She is the Rabbi Stanley M. Kessler Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace, and University Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies Emerita, Mary Jane Worthen, Professor of Jewish Studies Emerita, and Professor of New Testament Studies Emerita at Vanderbilt University. She has been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and her groundbreaking books like The Misunderstood Jew and Short Stories by Jesus have transformed the way millions of people read the Gospels. Today, she's going to take us inside the Jewish world that shaped everything Jesus said and did. The Pharisees are not who you think they are. The parables do not mean what you were taught. And the Jesus you meet in this conversation might be someone you have never been introduced to before. Now it's time to dig in. Welcome, everybody, to the Dig In podcast. I am your host, Pastor Johnny Over, and today our very special guest, Dr. Amy Jill Levine. Thank you so much for taking your time to join us today.
Happy to talk with you.
So let's jump right into our conversation. So you grew up as a Jewish girl, Catholic neighborhood in Massachusetts, and you've said that experience changed the way that you see Jesus forever. So if you could take us back to that childhood, when was the first time Jesus caught your attention?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure it changed the way I see him. It formed the way that I see him. I didn't have an earlier view that got changed. When I was a child, my parents would explain to me what my neighbors were doing religiously because we did different things, particularly on the weekend. They went to Mass. I went to Shabbos services, Sunday school. And my parents explained to me that my Catholic friends thought a Jewish man named Jesus and a Jewish woman named Mary were super important. And then I saw a bunch of statues. So my initial sense of Jesus was that he was a Jew who was persecuted by the Roman government, right? That nothing new there.
Right. Was it that's piqued your curiosity? Was it more, hey, how come they're doing different things than I'm doing?
That was part of it. Part of it was when I was 7, all of my girlfriends were preparing to make their first communion, and they all got a dress. So I'm in it for the accessories. And the thing that really, really struck me was when I was 7, again, a little girl said to me on the school bus, "You killed our Lord." And
Wow.
I said, "I didn't kill anybody because if you did, you would know." And she insisted that I did because her priest said so. And I thought the reason priests had to wear special collars was because the collar would choke the priest, were the priest to tell a lie. So I couldn't figure out when I was a child how this tradition, which my parents explained was very, very much like Judaism,
Sure.
and which had, the great accessories for First Communion and the bunny and Santa. I mean, how was this tradition saying horrible things about me? So I started asking questions then. I was 7 then. I'm turning 70 this year. So I've been doing this a long time.
Wow. Amazing. Really amazing. I know you're a committed Jewish woman who belongs to an Orthodox synagogue, and yet you've spent your entire career studying the New Testament, and I think most people would find that surprising. What is it about Jesus or that study that just keeps pulling you back towards the New Testament?
Yeah, well, there are a couple of things that are formative here. The first is it's all Jewish history. So if I want to understand part of my own tradition, then the New Testament is a source that fills in a number of gaps, particularly gaps in the first century, where we don't have any Jewish sources that are authoritative for us. So along with the Dead Sea Scrolls or the writings of the historian Josephus, the Jewish philosopher Philo, and all that other stuff that historians read, the New Testament is a very, very good source for understanding first century Judaism. And the other reason that I do it is because the more we can understand the New Testament within its historical context, the less likely we are to produce, the we being people in general, to produce anti-Jewish readings or anti-Semitic readings. Because I knew from that time when I was a kid that there are ways of reading the New Testament that will create anti-Semites. And I don't think that's necessary. There are
Sure.
ways of understanding Jesus that people kind of yank him out of his Jewish context. as opposed to seeing him in continuity with the scriptures of Israel, in continuity with Jewish teaching. So it's to recover Jewish history, and it's to stop anti-Semitism. Plus, it's interesting. I mean, it's
Right.
just fascinating literature.
It really is. And you hit on something I think is super important. History, context, culture. At our church, that's where we're big. It's one of the reasons why we started this podcast, was to get experts like yourself on to really try to get a better understanding of context, history, culture. Because I know there are words, sentences, even activities and things that we just read over in our 2026 context that we just gloss right over or think it's one thing without really truly understanding the roots behind this.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So, interesting fact here. You were the first Jewish person in history to teach New Testament at the Vatican's Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome, and you have sat down with Pope Francis 3 times. And I have to ask.
I didn't actually sit down with him. It's not like he had me on speed dial. I did get to meet him 3 times, and after the 3rd time, I didn't bother to collect the picture that the Vatican photographers take and all that. So just in 3 separate meetings, but nothing private. I'm hoping at some point I'll get to sit down, say, with Pope Leo and, have a cappuccino and have a really good discussion about revising the lectionary and retraining priests. But that will have to wait. Unless you have influence.
I might have to pull on a couple strings that I got to see if we can make that happen. But what was that experience like, meeting the Pope? Did you guys talk about anything, or was it just more of a meeting then?
It's more of a meet and greet, which is typical for this sort of thing.
Gotcha.
The work at the Pontifical Biblical Institute was the most important to me. I mean, even more than meeting the Pope, because I got to work with sort of the creme de la creme of people coming into the Catholic priesthood. Some of these young priests, some of whom will go on to teach in seminary contexts and graduate programs, and then they will be the leaders of the next generation. So to work with them, I taught a course on parables, to understand parables in their own context, but also to work with them on saying we can't just do history if we're doing Bible, because if we simply look at the Bible as an historical document, then how does it speak to us today?
Yeah.
So there also has to be, along with the history, what does this text mean to me, or what does this text mean to this congregation at this particular moment? What's the good news for today? So we worked on both the history and the pastoral aspects of the text.
Very cool. Very neat. The application aspect, not just the historical aspect. Very great. So you have a book called The Misunderstood Jew, and the subtitle is The Church and the Scandal of the Jewish Jesus. The word scandal, intentional, obviously. What is the scandal?
Yep. Well, the Greek term that typically gets translated as scandalous, it really means a stumbling block. It's stuff you trip over, and it's not good for you, and it's not good for anybody watching. The scandal, which is sometimes called the scandal of particularity, is to look at Jesus not simply as some sort of universal figure. I mean, in Christian theology, he is that, but he's also an historical figure embedded in a particular time and place. And that's the problem, is people don't want to acknowledge it. They don't want to do the work because that requires some history. They don't want to acknowledge in a number of cases that their understanding of Jesus might be wrong. I've had a number of students over the years say to me, like, Jesus invented love of God and love of neighbor. How fabulous is that? I say, well, no, love of God is Deuteronomy 6. Love of neighbor is Leviticus 19. And other Jews put those 2 verses together also. So the idea that Jesus doesn't have to be unique in all cases in order to be profound.
Right. Do you find that as a stumbling block for people when you're teaching?
People say, Jesus wasn't Jewish. He was like the first Christian. I'm thinking, well, he didn't know the word. Or comments like, okay, well, I finally acknowledge that Jesus was a Jew, but surely not the Blessed Mother, or these various comments where Jesus somehow has to be totally distinct,
Right.
or he was a Jew, but he was the only Jew who cared about like women's rights or healthcare or ecological concerns. So there's always this sense of I need to yank him out of his context. When it's bad Christian theology, because Christian theology, he's also fully human. It's bad history, and it's going to be bad for Jewish-Christian relations also.
Yeah. It's the stumbling block to almost mold Jesus or the Bible into our own particular cultures instead of allowing the culture he really was raised in to kind of, again, speak for itself.
Right, or put those two things into conversation, because we don't stop asking our own questions. We just have to realize that he might not be, given his historical context, interested in answering those questions as opposed to others. So then how do we do the interpretation?
Gotcha. You've said that many Christian sermons and Bible studies accidentally make Judaism look bad in order to make Jesus look good. Can you give our listeners an example of how that plays out on either a Sunday morning or in teachings that you've heard before?
But how long do we have? Um, standard sermons, when Jesus talks with a woman, the idea is first century Jews, women were oppressed and repressed and depressed and suppressed, and Jesus somehow comes along and invents feminism in the pantsuit, as opposed to seeing women. And you can do women's history through the New Testament, like they're in public and nobody goes, "Oh my God, it's a woman in public."
Right.
They're involved in the marketplace, in textile work. They're homeowners, they're patrons, they have access to their own funds, they have freedom of travel. So instead of seeing Jesus as inventing feminism, see Jesus as affirming women as his Jewish society would have. Or sermons that will sometimes, when the person giving the sermon or the homily does like a tiny bit of research, and they say things like, well, the Jews said, and then there's a quote from the Talmud from like 400 years later, women are a problem, and then Jesus affirms women. It's that kind of false history, comparing problematic passages from one tradition to very good passages in another, or presuming that one comment from 400 years later makes everything normative for the first century in Judaism. Comments like, Jews looked at sick people as marginal and unclean, and by healing people, Jesus invents, benevolent healthcare, as if Jews weren't in the healthcare business. And when we look at the New Testament and the Gospel stories or the Book of Acts, we find most people who are disabled or diseased embedded in household or familial context. And when Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law, that happens to be in Peter's house. It's not like he tossed her off on the street and said, "Okay, lady, you have a fever, out." And when Jesus engages with people who are in states of ritual purity, such as a person with a skin disease, or a woman with some sort of vaginal or uterine hemorrhage, he's not doing away with purity laws, and there's no law against him touching any of these people. What he's actually doing is restoring them to states of ritual purity.
Sure. So where do you think this oppressive mindset comes from?
Laziness, where people don't want to do the historical work. Tradition, because this is how texts have been interpreted over the centuries. So it's what people grew up with, and they don't bother to question it. A sense that for some people, there must have been something wrong with the system, that Jesus has to come and fix it, which is not necessarily the case. Paul talks about Jesus coming in the fullness of time. It means this is according to God's timetable. It doesn't mean that everything was just so awful, that so bad that now finally. And that's a sense of bad theology.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes a sense that in order to make Jesus look good, as I've mentioned, the worse you can make first century Judaism look, the better he looks in comparison. That actually strikes me as a form of weak theology. I think he looks fabulous. Look, I don't worship him as Lord and Savior, but boy, he was smart. So if I think he looks fabulous and compassionate and interesting and profound, and I don't need to make his context look bad, I don't think Christians need to do that either. But that's simply the way the system has carried through over the centuries.
Yeah, it's interesting because like evangelical Christians specifically, it's there's this almost extreme favoritism to the Jewish people, but at the same time, you're right. There is this like negative kind of Jesus had to come and wipe everything. Like it is so awful. Wipe the slate clean, rebuild everything from scratch. You got everything wrong, and lazy theology, lazy study habits, and it just creates a big monster, big bear in the church. Because really makes God look terrible, in my opinion, anyway. Some of the ways that we represent God and represent Christ.
Right, terrible or dramatically inconsistent. So when churches produce the model of the Old Testament God of wrath versus the New Testament God of love, that's actually a Christian heresy. It's the same God, the one who created heaven and earth. So when Jesus teaches his disciples, when you pray our Father, I mean, he's not inventing a new and better God. It's the same God. And when I get this nonsense from some of my students, which I've gotten over the years, about the Old Testament God of wrath versus the New Testament God of love, I just quote the text to them. Fine. The Lord is my shepherd who leads me beside still waters and restores my soul. That's Psalm 23. But you are condemned to the outer darkness where there's wailing and gnashing of teeth. And that's Jesus.
Right.
So, in the Old Testament, to use Christian terminology, I've got a good shepherd. And in the New Testament, you've got a sadistic dentist. I mean, and that's just the sense of bad comparison. It's bad history, it's bad literature, and it's bad theology.
So let's talk about the Pharisees a little bit here. Most Christians hear the word, immediately think hypocrite, legalist. And I know you co-edited an entire book on the Pharisees that even include an essay by Pope Francis. Set the record straight for us. Who were the Pharisees?
Right. Well, we start by noting that the only Pharisee from whom we have actual written records happens to be St. Paul of Tarsus. And I don't think Paul had like a morbid conception of his God or anything like that. The Pharisees, in order to figure out who they are, we have to look at all the sources we have of the period, which means not only looking at the gospel text, we also have to look at the book of Acts, where we have a Pharisee, fellow named Gamaliel, who speaks up on behalf of Peter and John. We have to look at the Gospel of John, where we have a Pharisee named Nicodemus, who also looks pretty good. I mean, I would date him. He seems kind of an interesting guy. We look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, where the word Pharisee isn't used, but it's clear that they're talking about Pharisees when they mention this group called seekers after smooth things. In other words, for the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Pharisees just make things too easy. The Pharisees are like, well, we know what you're supposed to do, but you're going to trip up because you're a human being. So when you trip up, here's what you do to fix it. Right? So they tend to be kind of lenient. When we get to rabbinic documents, the rabbis don't call themselves Pharisees, the early rabbinic documents, but it's clear that they're somehow consistent, more or less consistent with the tradition. And again, what they're trying to do is to take the law, the Torah, and update it to fit the needs of the particular communities, because all laws have to be updated, all laws have to be interpreted. Or we can look at the Jewish historian Josephus, who talks about the Pharisees as, and he's no fan of the Pharisees, by the way, he's a priest, and he thinks people ought to be listening to the priests, and he's incensed that people are actually listening to these Pharisees, this lay-led group, who've kind of gotten above their station. He said they like the simple life, they're out there among the people, they walk the walk as well as talking the talk. It's completely the opposite of what we get in, say, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 23. So when we put all this stuff together, what we find is the Pharisees at the time were the liberalizers. They're the ones who were interpreting the law based on new situations. You know, they're no longer living under their own government. They're living under Roman occupation. Technology has changed. Education has changed. Cultural concerns have changed. And the Pharisees are updating the text to say, here's how you live your life in conformity to Torah. And if you can't do everything perfectly, which nobody was expected to do anyway, here's what you can do. And finally, which I think is really important, the Pharisees were interested in a kind of egalitarian move. The book of Exodus said that all the people, all of Israel, should be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So how do you do that when you have an inherited priesthood, which are the elite group? This is why, for example, the Pharisees are interested in washing their hands before they eat, which, after COVID turned out to be a good idea before they eat. Why? Because when the priests would touch the sacrificial elements in the temple, they would wash their hands to begin with. This is a general thing that even pagans did. So they said you could be like the priests at your own meal. So just as the priests wash their hands, so you can wash your hands. And that's something everybody could do.
Right.
So they're interested in extending priestly privilege. That's an egalitarian move rather than a legalistic whatever. They're interested in saying, how do you profess who you are on a daily basis, so religion is not like, 1 hour in the morning on the weekend? How do you live a life of sanctity?
Where, again, I guess the answer is going to be lazy theology again. Where does these characters come from? Like how we paint the pictures of Caiaphas, or how we paint the pictures of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Like, they're always painted as the bad guys, right? And Jesus and his apostles are the good guys. So where, if what do we have from Caiaphas, or what do we have from the Pharisees that would even show that?
Yeah, Caiaphas isn't a Pharisee. He is the high priest. We know the most about him, aside from the New Testament, from the Jewish historian Josephus, who says not much happened under Caiaphas. Well, there you go. So we get it from select readings of the New Testament. But even when we're looking at the Gospels, we have to recognize that they are themselves selective readings. Anytime we report what happens, we're always going to spin it depending upon, because no historian is completely objective. You have to figure out what to say, and you have to figure out what words to use to say it. which is why following, say, a political speech, depending upon who the commentator is, best speech ever, worst speech ever.
Exactly. Yeah.
Everything was true, everything was false. And it helps to read a variety of sources to try to figure out exactly what happened. And back then, we don't have all this stuff on tape either. Um, so as the Gospels are being written, and most historians will date the Gospels sometime toward the end of the first century, if not toward the beginning of the second century. So we're at least a generation after Jesus. Jesus and his initial followers spoke Aramaic. The Gospels are written in Greek, and now we have the sense of how do these stories go from the oral tradition, which we don't have access to because it's oral, into writing, and then what text were the Gospel writers using? They're going to adapt their story, and part of the way they're going to adapt their story is to say, gee, we've got these non-Messianic Jews down the street, and they seem to be doing okay, and they represent a challenge to us. And they're reading the same books that we're reading. They're reading Isaiah, and they're reading the Psalms, and they're coming up with different interpretations. Well, they can't possibly be right if we're right, in this sense of a binary world. So one way of affirming one's own identity, of saying who you are, is to say who you're not, and they become the negative foils. I mean, and this is the way historical studies work. And instead of recognizing the texts as not objective treatments, which they're not, they're theological documents, but they're not objective treatments, is to say, here's how Matthew defines Matthew's group over against the Pharisees, who are like the potential rivals. And we can see the same thing in the Dead Sea Scrolls. When the Dead Sea Scrolls talk about the Pharisees as seekers after smooth things, they're not being complimentary.
Right.
The problem is that the Dead Sea Scrolls did not become the sacred scripture of a largely non-Jewish audience, but the New Testament does.
Gotcha. Interesting points. Very interesting. When you strip away 2,000 years of church tradition and place Jesus Christ fully back inside Second Temple Judaism, what changes? What does Jesus actually look like?
He looks like a first century Jew, a really interesting first century Jew. And what changes is not only how we might understand him as continuous with his culture. I mean, he has to make sense to the people at the time. Otherwise, they just would have looked at them and said, well, this makes no sense whatsoever. But we also change our knowledge of Second Temple Judaism. So not only can we use Judaism, or Jewish history, Jewish practice and belief to understand Jesus better, we can also use Jesus and the New Testament better to understand Second Temple Judaism, to recognize that in Second Temple Judaism, that there are various ways of understanding God. There are various ways of understanding possibilities of superhuman individuals. The philosopher Philo talks about Moses as if he's some sort of God, actually. The incarnation makes more sense. So what makes sense in a Jewish context in the year, say, 30 or the year 70 does not make sense in a Jewish context in the year 500. In the same way that the early church had to figure out, well, what exactly do we think about Jesus? Is he God? Is he subordinate to God? Is he a human who somehow got divinized? Is he divine from the beginning? And we can see those debates already in the New Testament, that they come up through church history. So by understanding Jesus as a Jew, we understand him differently within cultural context, but we also understand a little bit more of what the parameters of belief in Second Temple Judaism are.
Right. Now, contrary, I know, to popular belief, even the miracles that Jesus has done would not make him, again, at least the way it's reported anyway, not make him unique compared to anybody else or a couple other people out there, because there are other people reportedly doing miracles as well. What would you say to that about a differentiator about Christ? Does his miracles make him a divine, or what they viewed as divine? Was that a mindset?
I did a whole book called Signs and Wonders addressing precisely that topic. Yeah, there are other miracles at the time. There are other exorcists at the time. And some of them are successful, and some of them are looked at as like special people. Woo. We already have, again, to use Christian terminology from the Old Testament, we have healers and miracle workers. So that Jesus walks on water, the prophet Elisha makes an axe head float. Jesus heals multiple people with limited resources, so does the prophet Elisha. Jesus raises children from the dead, so does Elijah, so does Elisha. And we go to early rabbinic commentaries. We have rabbis who are also miracle workers. So miracle working doesn't make you divine. Could people have presumed that the divine was working through you? Absolutely. By the way, we also have miracle workers among non-Samaritan, non-Jewish groups as well. They're pagan miracle workers or Gentile miracle workers. So they're kind of out there. What miracles do, by the way, is they certainly gain attention. Right? I mean, if you just got up on a stone one day and say, hey, a sower went out to sow, nobody cares. But if you exorcise a demon and then say a sower went out to sow, oh, this guy's got some sort of credibility. Let's pay attention. It's a great way of gathering crowds. It's probably a way that Jesus would solidify his own knowledge of who he was and what he was doing. It's a sign of the inbreaking of the Messianic age, a time when there's no longer not only war and poverty and death, but there's also no disease. There's no pain. So that's a lovely sense of, what am I trying to do in bringing about the kingdom of God? Well, part of it is restoring people to their full-bodied wholeness or their full mental state, exorcising demons. Does it make you God? No. But if you already believe that Jesus is God, is that one of the contributing factors? Absolutely. So it becomes a retrospective reading. I do think, by the way, I think Jesus did miracles. I just don't think he's the only one.
Gotcha.
Oh, one other thing about that, just
Sure.
to note.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. You can also work miracles through Satan.
Right.
We got to be careful about this. I mean, a miracle tells you that somebody's now who could not walk can now walk. Who's responsible? Is it God? Is it Satan? Is it psychosomatic? So once you have the thing itself, it doesn't necessarily tell you what the cause is. That's a matter of interpretation.
Yeah, I think now, again, speaking from my understanding of a Christian perspective, I see, I guess, similar where a lot of Christians kind of get duped into like, oh, man, this speaker is very engaging. Miracles, signs, and wonders happen and things like that. And people are always drawn to those things. And in the text, you see, Moses, they go in miracle for miracle with the warlocks of the time, the snake and everything. This snake's devouring this snake. And even the in the New Testament, his name is slipping away from me. But again, performing miracles, wowing the crowds.
Magus.
Yes,
Simon Magus.
Just wowing the crowds, and even Jesus said, "A wicked and perverse generation seeks signs and wonders." As he's doing signs and wonders, I think it's a cautionary tale. Don't be fooled by the signs and wonders that you see. Sticking divinity on everything that happens to be unexplainable, I guess would be
right. You actually raise a really good point about how we function. So, like, we want the signs and wonders, but what after we get them, then what?
Right.
It's like the politician who promises everything, or the great victory parade. Well, what happens the next day?
Yeah.
Or isn't he fabulous? He does signs and wonders. Well, then how come we don't pay attention to him when he says, love your enemies? I mean, so there's a fair amount of disjunction going on there as well.
Definitely. The Christian walk is, now I joke about it, but it's like kind of like not all joking. There's truth to it. We become spiritual addicts to the church. They come on Sundays, they get their hit, or they get a prophetic word, or something happens. And then on Monday, they're not cultivated or taught to live a life. And I think the point that you just brought up is amazing. Our church is very much focused on even the works of you, loving your neighbors. How about being kind and generous to people, helping the widows, the orphans. I mean, these are things that I think bring functional living to society just in general that we could pull from what Jesus has taught in the New Testament. But we're always about the hype. We want the next big thing. And it's just, I think that goes down a slippery slope when we do stuff like that. So back onto what you had mentioned before, a lot of Christians are taught that Jesus came to abolish the law, that he replaced the system of rules with a message of grace, but it's not what you see when you read the Gospels through Jewish eyes. I know you brought up the Pharisees, it kind of making it easier for people to attain. Can you expand a little bit more on some of those things?
Well, you don't have to get to that point by reading the Gospels through Jewish eyes. You just have to read the Gospels. Start with Matthew. Don't think that I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I've not come to abolish, but to fulfill. And fulfill does not mean I'm going to do it and check it off the list so you don't have to. Fulfill means I'm going to show you how to do this in its fullness. And then Jesus proceeds to interpret the law or the Torah. Actually, law is not a great interpretation of Torah. Torah really means instruction. So he said, you have heard it said to people of old, don't murder, right? And then most English translations read, but I say to you, but it really should be, and I say to you, because he's not doing a contrast. It's not an antithesis. An antithesis, an opposite would be, you have heard it said, don't murder, but I say to you, lock and load. That's an antithesis. What he says is, but I say to you, don't be angry with a brother or sister, right? The law says don't commit adultery. He says, any man who looks at a woman with lust is already guilty. That's not abolishing the law, actually making it stricter. And here's where Jewish history helps. The Mishnah, this early compendium of Jewish law, talks about building a fence about the Torah. And what they mean by that is you have a law, you make another law to make sure you don't violate the first one. It's not a matter of legalism. It's a matter of being consistency and being intentional. So if you're not angry, you're less likely to murder. If you don't think about committing adultery, because you have to rent a room or whatever. If you don't think about it, then you're less likely to do it. So Jesus is by no means doing away with the law, nor were the Pharisees all this kind of legalistic. Every time you hear the word legalistic, it really means Jewish. And it very often becomes a kind of Protestant term. Look at the Catholics, look at what they're doing. That's how that word comes into English vocabulary eventually. When we see Paul in the book of Acts, Paul never gives up following Torah. I mean, he's an entirely faithful Jew. He goes into the temple and offers a sacrifice for men who have taken a Nazirite vow. He wants to go to Jerusalem for the pilgrimage festivals. He honors the Sabbath and keeps it holy by going into synagogues and teaching. So Paul doesn't think once he becomes a follower of Jesus, he suddenly dumps his own Jewish identity. He's still a Pharisee. He identifies himself. I'm a Pharisee, the son of Pharisees, right? He just thinks he's a better Pharisee because he's now got Jesus. So the law is not, first of all, the law is not a problem. The law is a blessing. Second, Jesus does not do away with the law. He actually intensifies it. And the third thing is, and here we get to Paul, the reason most Christians today do not follow Torah is because Paul says, if you follow Torah with all these particular commandments, including circumcision, then you'd be converting to Judaism. But Paul, as a first century Jew, thinking about the Messianic age having begun with Jesus, thinks, okay, one of the signs of the Messianic age is that all people, every nation and tongue, will turn to worship the God of Israel. We've got an image of that in the book of Revelation, by the way. Every tongue and nation and whatever, all worshiping at the throne of God. Well, so if you convert to Judaism, and all these Gentiles convert to Judaism, the only nation that's going to be worshiping the God of Israel are going to be the Jews. So Paul says, you don't convert. That's the thing. That's the Jews thing. That's not you. You remain Gentile. You don't convert to Judaism. You don't circumcise, which is the big sign for men. You just remain Gentiles, but you're Gentiles who are now Gentiles in Christ, Gentiles in the Lord, adopted into this family, but you don't convert to Judaism. And then what happened as time went on and people lost the fact that Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles and he's writing to Gentiles. They thought that these negative commandments about the law had to do with all people. And then any sort of following the law becomes a problem. And since Jews follow Torah, then Jews are.
Gotcha. Now, here's something that will surprise a lot of the listeners. You have said that almost nothing Jesus taught was unique to him, that most of his teachings have parallels in Jewish tradition. Does that diminish Jesus in your eyes, or you think it actually makes him more powerful?
It's neither one nor the other. It's just an historical fact. What it does do, however, is it helps us understand where he is entirely distinct. I don't know of anybody else who said you have to love your enemies. That's a lot. Josephus, our first century historian, says we are commanded to treat our enemies with moderation. If they're hungry, we have to give them food. This goes back to the book of Proverbs, by the way. If your enemy is hungry, you have to feed him. If your enemy is thirsty, you have to provide drink. If your enemy is lost, you have to show the road. But nothing says you have to love them. And Jesus is like, let's one up that. And that's also this kind of building the fence about the Torah, right? I think that's wonderful. But, love your neighbor as yourself. We already got that. What Jesus also does is I think he helps us sometimes reframe what we already know and try to figure out what priorities are. So that in the very famous parable called the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10, the run up to that is Jesus is having a chat with a lawyer and they get around to talking about neighbors. They get to love God, love neighbor, and they're all fine on that. And then the lawyer says to Jesus, because he's trying to make himself look good in the crowd, who is my neighbor? Which in the first century is actually, in fact, today, it's a really, really good question. Neighbors are people with the same rights and responsibilities that you have. The book of Leviticus, which says love your neighbor as yourself, goes on to say in the very same chapter, Leviticus 19, You also have to love the ger, the non-native born, sometimes translated stranger, sojourner, resident alien, immigrant. You have to love the immigrant because you were immigrants in the land of Egypt. In other words, you love the neighbor because the neighbors like you as part of your group, and you love the non-neighbor because you knew what it was like to be socially vulnerable. Right? But determining who's a neighbor and who's a stranger is like that's really important.
Sure.
Um, like take the example, Canadians, right? So I'm a US citizen. Canadians are strangers. They don't get to vote in our elections. They have to go through certain loopholes in order to get into the country, whatever. You still have to love them.
Of course.
Right?
Yep.
So our Canadians' neighbors are strangers. At the first century, Samaritans were the test case. The Samaritans have the same Torah that the Jews have, with a couple of small differences, but not in terms of daily practice. Are they in or are they out? Can you share table fellowship with them? Can you intermarry? That's a really good question. But at the end of the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus changes the question. It's not who is the neighbor, which is still a good question. It's
Right.
who acted as neighbor to the fellow who fell among the robbers. Maybe the issue is let's reframe the question, or let's try to figure out what's more important and what's less important. He says in Matthew 23, which is the invectives against scribes and Pharisees, you tithe mint and dill and cumin, minor commandments, but you neglect the weightier matters of the law. You ought to do it all. Promote the, justice and compassion over tithing. I think that's right.
Yeah. Yeah. So you hit on the Good Samaritan. I know you wrote an entire book, whereas I think short stories by Jesus, and you argue that Christians have been misreading parables for centuries. You briefly mentioned here the Good Samaritan. I want to go over to the Prodigal Son because it's probably one of the most known parables in history. And the standard interpretation is that the father represents God's grace and the older brother represents legalistic Judaism. You say that reading that is really deeply problematic. So what's actually happening in this story?
I don't want to take away the idea that the father represents God's grace. As I put it in the book, I have spent years up until COVID, and then when I retired from Vanderbilt, teaching in a maximum security prison with men who have done some quite horrific things in their lives. And for a number of them, looking at the father in the parable as God, and they see themselves as the younger brother who is dramatically screwed up. So they need that image of grace. I don't want to take that from them. I think it's a good reading. But when Christians say to me, "Oh, this is the Old Testament God, the Jewish God who would be harsh and not receptive at all, so Jesus therefore invents the loving Father God," well, that's ahistorical and it's anti-Semitic and it's just plain wrong. If we want to look at the older brother as representing legalistic Judaism, and people get that when the older brother says to dad, I've never disobeyed you and you've never even given me a young goat. It's like Jews are, they're following the law in order to get some sort of eternal reward, whatever. I mean, this is a false reading of why Jews follow Torah. Jews don't follow Torah in order to earn divine grace. We've already got that, which is how we got the Torah in the first place. So we follow Torah as a reciprocal concern. God shows us love by giving us the Torah. We show God's love by following what God gave us, right? And it actually enhances the relationship. I think the parable, which is the third of three parables, so it's the lost sheep, the lost coin, and these two lost kids, and I'm not sure the father's entirely found either. You can take it as about God's grace, but you don't have to have a negative image in order to get to God's grace. But I also think parables generally, in terms of genre, what parables do, they're frequently like ethical prompts. They're not moralistic stories, but they're ethical prompts that help us think about the world otherwise. Or, as I mentioned before, Jesus likes to reframe the question. Parables will frequently tell us stuff that we already know, but we've got it so deep down and repressed. And he kind of brings it out with this beautiful type of heart surgery. In the first parable, there's a fellow, he's never called a shepherd. He's a guy who owns 100 sheep. And he loses one. Okay, at this point, I don't think he's God because God doesn't lose us. I think he's a guy who lost a sheep. And he realizes he's lost the sheep and he has to go find it. So the first question is, how do you know you've got 100 sheep? How do you know you've lost one? Because it's not like they line up in groups of 10 and you can do it like a roll call. The only way you know is if you count. And then there's a woman who's lost a coin. Again, if you want to make the first parable about God and the third parable about God, then that woman has to be God too. And my Christian friends will go, "Oh, no, I can't go quite there." I think she's a lady who lost a coin. She loses her coin. Then she finds it. How do you know you've lost a coin? You have to count them.
Right.
Um, and then we begin a parable that says there was a man who had two sons. As soon as we call it the parable of the prodigal son, we've already screwed the parable. It's about a guy with two sons. And the reason we call it the prodigal son is because Christians have always identified with the younger brother, who discovers God's grace. Well, what he discovers, just in historical sense, is Daddy loves him. Daddy never stopped loving him. Nor am I convinced that this guy sinned. I think he was dumb. I think he was stupid. He blew all his money in dissolute living, but I'm not sure that's a sin. That's just bad behavior. Like he spent it on parties for all of his friends. Okay. And then there's a famine, and then he's hungry, and he goes to work for a pig farmer, which is a come down for a Jewish kid. But there's nothing illegal about feeding pigs. Right? It's not like he's eating them. Moreover, Jewish law says you live by the law, you don't die by it. So if you're going to starve to death, of course you would eat. Um, and he realizes his father has hired hands. In fact, his father has enslaved people working for him. So he figures, I'll go back to Dad and say I sinned. Fine. Dad sees him in the distance, runs out, puts his arm around, kisses him, not to prevent the neighbors from stoning him. As Dad loves his son, right? Like the sheep owner wanted the sheep and the woman wanted her coin. So the problem with the parable is that line, which most people ignore. The older brother was in the field. He heard the sound of music and dancing. And he asked an enslaved person what's going on. And the enslaved person says, oh, your brother came back safe and sound, and Dad killed the fatted calf. Right? And the older brother refused to come in. In other words, Dad had enough time to call the band and the caterer, and he didn't call the older brother, which means there was a man who had two sons, and he forgot to count. So the parable's not only about divine grace. It can certainly be about that. But it's also about making sure that you remember not just the people who have strayed and come back, but the people who have always been faithful. And they're the ones who are usually ignored, discounted, not given any sort of recognition. I mean, not that they're going to act for recognition, they're going to act out of love, but not actually acknowledging them on a human level. Let's pay attention to them too.
That's a great point.
So I think the parable interrogates all of us. For me as a teacher, the weaker students, because they're the ones who have to come for extra help, right? You don't want them to fall because it's too much paperwork. And the really smart students, because they're the ones who make it so you don't have to grade on a curve. But what do you do with that, that shy person who's getting like 88, 89, can't crack the A, doesn't want to come to your office because doesn't want to be a bother? How do you make sure that that student feels as counted as the ones who are at the top or the ones who are at the bottom?
Really amazing.
How do you recognize the people who are part of our daily lives and we simply ignore them or take them for granted? Yeah. The parable interrogates us on that. So it's not only good news about God's grace, parables are also interrogations to us. How do we be better human beings? And I think that's part of Jesus' agendas. How do you be a better you?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's an amazing point that you brought up. Wow. Never looked at it from that way before, really, but it's so true. Really is true. Couple more, just two more questions here. The first one on the parables. I've always were taught, and we're always around, that the parables are comforting. They're meant to comfort. Jesus is dumbing these things down for us to understand. But you're saying they never were meant to comfort. They're designed to provoke, to disturb, and to make people feel uncomfortable. Speak on that a little bit, or give us another example there.
Yeah, well, I also don't think Jesus dumbed things down. I think that's not helpful, and that's not what good teachers do. You don't have to use all sorts of fancy technical terminology in order to explain something, but that's not dumbing it down. The problem in most Christian settings is that parables are taught to little children, because little children can get simplistic messages from them. Like the prodigal son means God loves you even if you spill your milk. I mean, whatever it is. So they get this. But they're not children's stories. They're of the same genre as wisdom literature, like the book of Proverbs or the book of Ecclesiastes or the book of Job, or from the pagan side, Aesop's fables. So Aesop's fables typically tell us stuff we don't want to acknowledge, like slow and steady really does win the race.
Right.
And most of us just want to speed through things. So I think the parables are generally designed to discomfort, to shake us up. And even people who think they're doing pretty well, and I think most people probably think that, so you could do better. So there's this old line, I don't know who invented it, said religion in general was designed to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortables. So if you want something that's going to comfort the afflicted, those are the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the peacemakers. Right. That's comforting folks who are having difficulties. I think parables are primarily designed to afflict the comfortable.
Wow.
And of course, we don't want that, because who wants to be afflicted?
Yeah, who wants to suffer, right? Who wants to be pushed?
So, and the brilliant thing about Jesus here is the parables are also generally, I mean, some of them are not, but a lot of them are actually kind of funny. So at the same time we're being afflicted, we're also smiling. It's like listening to a really good satirist talking about somebody for whom you voted, and you're going, yeah, that's true too. But as long as you're kind of laughing along with it, you're also thinking, yeah, this is probably right. I need to work on this.
Sure.
So they're not dumbed down, but neither are they children's stories. They can be made into children's stories, but they're not children's stories. They're very, very cool.
Gotcha. Love it. Last question, Dr. Levine. You're a Jewish woman. You spent your entire life not just helping Christians, but all people understand the scriptures more deeply. As you mentioned before, you do not believe Jesus is the Messiah, yet you've dedicated everything to this work of understanding the Bible with its true Jewish roots. After all these years, what is it about Jesus that you would want Christians to truly understand about him?
I want them to read the Gospels rather than take other people's word for it. It's like, take some personal responsibility here, and then go read scholars who are not interested in promoting anti-Semitism, who are interested in knowing the first century context, who know the history, who know the literature, who can read the primary sources, and not yank Jesus out of his Jewish context, but recognize him as continuous with Jewish thought at the period. Because I think that helps him understand Jesus better. It also helps in Jewish-Christian relations. If you love Jesus, which is what Christians claim to do, then it seems to me that one would want to know everything there is to know about him. Just as you fall in love with somebody, like, where did you go to elementary school, and what's your favorite color, and what foods do you like? So learn something about that cultural context, and learn about it from people who are credible historians, who are not set on yanking Jesus out of that context. And there are a number of Christian writers, if they won't trust me, there are a number of Christian writers who do that well also. I'm not the only one.
Sure. Dr. Levine, this has been an absolute pleasure. You are wonderful, and I really enjoyed the conversation thoroughly.
What fun to talk with you. Thank you for your good questions.
Thanks for tuning in to the Dig In podcast with me, Johnny Ova. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on YouTube, and don't forget to rate us 5 stars on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can also check out more at soh.church. See you next time as we keep digging in.